Can you think of a moment, maybe a time when less is actually more? Now I can think of one because I knew a guy one time whose name was Less More. But besides somebody's name, well, what are some things that when you've got less, you've actually got more? I think of about stuff, right? If we have less stuff, then that obviously means we have more space. If we have less spending, that should mean that we have more money, right? If we have less doubt, we should have more believing. And probably one of the hardest things, if we have less talking, hopefully we have more listening. Here's our key today that I want us to get to as we go through a passage in the book of Judges is that with God, sometimes less is actually more. Today we're going to look at a leader of Israel, or one of these judges that God had raised from among the people in order to deliver them from their cycle of sin. And this is a man today who God chose, who on the surface wasn't very strong. He wasn't very courageous, at least when the story begins. He would end up having to face his fears and his insecurities. But the question really is, would those weaknesses in him, would it limit what God could do, what God could do through him? And in the same way, we ask that in our own life. Do our own limitations, do our weaknesses, does it limit what God can do in us? I want us to listen to how God called and strengthened a man named Gideon, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that story, and used him to do some very great things in spite of his weaknesses. I want us to listen how God had brought hope and had brought faith to Gideon as well as to his people, and think about how God wants to do that in our lives as well. I want to kind of story through this. We're not going to read it verse by verse necessarily, but if you want to follow along, we're going to be in Judges chapter 6 and Judges chapter 7. This is where the account comes from. So we have here again this cycle. The Israelites have rebelled against God yet again. And so he let a group of people to rule over them. In this case, it wasn't the Canaanites this time. It was another group of ites. It was the Midianites. And these Midianites were so oppressive that the Israelites actually had to go hide in the mountains and caves. So, of course, as often was the case, when they got to this place of despair, Israel cried out to their God for help. An angel of the Lord came to this man, Gideon, and he said to Gideon, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Now, Gideon asked after this response why the people had been abandoned by God. When he was approached by this angel, his first thought was, "Why have you abandoned us, God? Why do the miracles of old not happen anymore?" And the angel told him to use what strength that he had to deliver Israel. Now, Gideon asked, "Well, how can I do that? After all, I'm from the weakest clan, and I'm from the weakest family within that clan." And the angel of the Lord responded to Gideon and said, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites together." Now, Gideon wanted to know here, because of his hesitation, if this was really God that was speaking to him. So he asked if he could get an offering and bring it back. And with permission, God, the angel of the Lord there, Gideon brought an offering of meat and bread to the Lord. And the angel of the Lord touched it with his staff, and fire fled up. And then Gideon realized that this was truly an angel of the Lord. So he built an altar there, and he named the place, "The Lord is Peace." That same night, the Lord told Gideon to tear down his father's altar to a false god, Baal, and to build a true altar to the Lord in its place. Well, Gideon did as the Lord had said, but he did it at night because he was scared. He was afraid of his father and of the men of the town and what they might do to him for tearing down that altar to Baal. Now, when the men woke up that next morning and discovered what had happened, they found out Gideon was the one responsible. So they went to Gideon's father and demanded that Gideon be put to death. But his father refused and told them that if Baal was a real God, then he could defend himself. Isn't that an amazing statement? I wish, that we could have that kind of courage like Gideon's father did. Now, soon afterward, the Midianites crossed over the Jordan to raid into Israel and into the people there. And God's Spirit came upon Gideon, and Gideon blew a trumpet as a call to arms. But Gideon still wanted to know if God was really going to save Israel through him. Remember, from the weakest clan, from the weakest family. So he asked for a pledge from God. He put wool on the ground and told God if the dew was on the wool and not on the ground around it, that he would know for sure that God was with him. So when Gideon got up the next morning, that's what he found. The ground was dry, but the wool was wet enough for him to squeeze a bowl full of water out of it. But then to make sure, he humbly asked for the opposite sign. He would put out wool. He was looking for dry wool and wet ground. The next morning, that's exactly what happened. Twice the Lord affirmed to Gideon that his hand was on him. And as they camped near the enemy, God told Gideon he had too many people, that the Israelites might think that they won by their own strength if they defeated Midian with such a large army. So God told Gideon something like we've been talking about the past few weeks that doesn't make any sense on the surface. God told Gideon to tell everyone who was afraid to leave. And when Gideon did that, 22,000 men left the army, and that left 10,000 for Gideon. Well, the Lord said that was still too many. So he told Gideon to take all the men down to the water and separate those who got down on their knees to drink from those who lifted the water up to their mouths with their hands. And after he'd done that, only 300 lifted the water with their hands. So God told Gideon to keep those and to send the rest home. So Gideon took up his position, not with 22,000 men, not with 30,000 men, not with 10,000 men. Gideon took up his position to attack the Midianites with only 300 men. Gideon divided his men into 3 groups, gave each man a trumpet and an empty jar with a torch inside, and the 3 groups gathered around the edges of the enemy camp. And when Gideon gave the signal, they all blew their trumpets and smashed their jars and held up their torches and shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Well, the Midianites obviously were surprised at this attack, and they realized they were surrounded. They thought at least they were because of all the torches, and many of them began to run, and some even started fighting with each other because they couldn't tell who was friend and who was foe. And as the army fled, many of the men from Israel pursued them and cut them off from escaping, and they captured and killed the 2 Midianite leaders, and they won a great victory over their oppressors. This victory was a sign of assurance, of hope and faith. It was a sign of hope to Israel because Israel was going to be delivered from the oppression and the tyranny of the Midianites. But it was also an assurance of faith. Gideon would be the mighty warrior called by God to accomplish this great thing in spite of his weaknesses. Now, after hearing this account, what are some takeaways that you might have when you hear this story? Right? What principles can we take from this story and figure out how we can make those part of our thinking today? Well, I wrote a few down. I want to give them to you. A couple life lessons, I guess, from Gideon's story. Number one is we have to make sure we realize how easy it is sometimes to ignore personal accountability and just to blame the problems we have on someone else, particularly God. You remember at the very beginning, Gideon questioned God about the problems his nation faced. God, why have you abandoned us? Where are the miracles of the old days? He was asking about God's apparent lack of help. What we don't see there, Gideon never did really acknowledge that the people were the ones who brought the tragedy upon themselves when they decided to disobey and to neglect God. It would be like someone who maybe wanted to go swimming and they were going to go to a pond. It wasn't their pond, it was someone else's. And in order to get in that pond, they had to climb over a fence and over a locked gate, and they had to walk down a road, and they had to go past a sign that said private property, no swimming, right? Danger. Yet they go swimming anyways, and what if something tragic happened? Well, is it the property owner's fault that the person went over the fence, went over the gate, walked right past the sign that said danger, no swimming? Well, sure, that's not the property owner's fault. That was the person's fault. They were accountable for their own decisions and their own actions. So that, to me, is one of the takeaways from this is we can't ever forget about personal accountability. To just cry out and blame God for what's going on in our life without thinking, have I brought some of this on myself? The Israelites had done that. There was no need to blame God. They had messed things up just fine on their own. A second thing is to realize that fear sometimes causes us to seek reassurance from God, when really we should be taking action to just simply obey what He's already commanded us to do. In the story about the fleece, and that's a very popular story or account that we talk about a lot, is putting out the fleece. Gideon didn't use this fleece, didn't use this wool in order to discover God's will, right? The angel already told him what he was supposed to do. He already knew God's will. The wool there was used to strengthen his weak faith. And we have to be careful as we go about our Christian life that we don't misapply this idea of the fleece. What Gideon did is not prescriptive, right? It's just because it's in the Bible, it's not saying this is what you do to determine God's will. It's just there because it's what happened. Gideon didn't need to use the fleece for confirmation. He didn't need to use the fleece to be assured of success because God had already told him that the victory would come. Sometimes we want to put out the fleece to see if something is God's will for us, but that's not what's being done in the story, and that's not a lesson for us to do, to put out the fleece. We need to see that these two signs that Gideon asked for were supernatural signs. What Gideon asked for would never happen without God's intervention. They were miracles. And today, when we use things like the fleece, we're talking about things that often or not could naturally happen without God's intervention. You know, I'm going to put a for sale sign in my yard, and if my house sells, then it was God's will. You know, I got an offer for a new job, and because someone called me about it and I wasn't looking for a job, then that must be God's will for me. That's a sign. Right? We put out the wool, we put out the fleece like that, and we say, well, if it happens, it's God's will. We have to see that these two signs that Gideon put out and that God was willing to work with Gideon through, what they really do is they show how patient and how kind God was. They showed God's grace toward Gideon, to a man who was weak in the faith. God can and does give us assurance today in our answers to prayer. But if we want to know His will, then God's Word gives us two pieces of instruction. And I'll give you this as an assignment. Go and look up for yourself Proverbs 3:5, and then look up James chapter 1, verse 5 through 7. Don't put out the fleece, please. That's not prescriptive for us. Lastly, I just think we need to remember that God wanted no one to doubt who was responsible for the victory. So what did He do? He whittled down Gideon's army to only 300 men. So there was no way they could say victory was done through their own strength. And there'll often be times in our own life when God will strip away those things or those people that we tend to lean on. And He brings us into a situation to where we become very aware of our shortcomings, of our limits, of our weaknesses. Why does He do that? Right? What's the point of that? Well, it makes us more dependent upon Him. It helps us to remember that it's God's strength through us and in us that allows us to accomplish those things for Him. And then it brings God even greater glory when we're used in our own weakness. There'll be times when we find ourselves in a similar position to Gideon about not being able to see how God can use us. But Jesus gives us the same promise today that God had given Gideon. In Matthew chapter 28, verse 20, Jesus says, "Surely I will be with you always to the very end of the age." If we grasp this like Gideon did, then we will be people who can make a difference. We don't have to be clever. We don't have to be influential. We don't have to be funny. All that is necessary is that we're committed to Christ, that we're obedient to His Word, and we're depending on Him for strength and for wisdom. Remember, one of the most influential Christians who ever lived, the Apostle Paul, had these words to say in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10. Paul said, "When I am weak, then I am strong." It's a paradox, right? It doesn't make any sense to the world, but it's the truth of God. God gave Gideon hope in spite of his struggles. He gave Gideon hope in spite of his weak faith. And if we make ourselves available to God, He will use us in spite of our weaknesses. It's my prayer today that you find all your strength, that you find all your hope, that you find all your faith in your relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. Thanks for watching today. God bless, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.